Hello, OSA fans. We'll be continuing our series on fish diseases, starting up next with a disease that we at OSA despise in particular. This is the scourge, the big baddie of anyone that deals with large amounts of marine fish anywhere. This is Cryptocaryon irritans, saltwater ick, one of the big nasty daddies. Don't let the name fool you. Just because it shares a similar name as the freshwater ick, this one's a lot more difficult to deal with. So we'll be confronting how to identify it, prevent it, and treat it, both in fish only and in mixed reef aquariums. So what the heck is saltwater ick? Well, even though it shares the same name as Ichthyopteris multifilus, saltwater ick is not directly related. It is a ciliated parasite. It is still a protozoan, so they are the same type of organism, but they are not directly related. They're what we call like analog critters. So they're diseases that mimic the same kind of disease in saltwater and in freshwater, even though they're caused by different organisms. So saltwater ick, Cryptocaryon irritans, this infects the skin and gill tissues of marine fish. So it does the same thing that freshwater ick does. It forms these large collective bodies on the skin surface of the fish and acts like a oil rig full of vampires, tapping the fluids, rupturing tissues, and extracting the fish until it dies. And then all these bodies manifest as white spots scattered across the fish's skin, gills, and fins. So this is why it's called white spot disease. And this can be devastating and wipe out entire reef tanks. It can be extremely sad because you can have very expensive, nice fish and have them for years, and then a novel infestation of saltwater ick can wipe out hundreds, if not thousands, of dollars worth of livestock in a matter of days and weeks. Here's a histology slide from the Georgia Aquarium, gill biopsy. You can see the feeding stage of the ciliate as it's burrowing into this gill tissue and extracting blood and other vital fluids, inducing all kinds of stress. The nefarious. This is the life cycle of Cryptocaryon irritans. Paramount to understand this in order to be able to confront this disease. So has a very similar lifestyle as Ichthyopteris multifilus. So we have the trophont. So it's the feeding stage, the oil rig run by vampires tapping all the fluids. That will detach into the sinking stage called the prototomont, which will sink down into the sediment or somewhere else in a nook or cranny in the aquaria. And then that will reproduce in an encysted stage and be able to be resistant to most treatments and be the stubborn holdout stage that will be most nefarious. And then even more nefarious will be when they hatch out into those harpoon free swimming therons, which will smell out stressed out and vulnerable fish and penetrate their skin and then manifest back into the disease stage of the organism. So here we can see how to identify ick as the white spot disease with all these trophonts. Ugh, poor clownfish. Ugh. And then this organism will get stressed. It'll flash. It'll scrape itself up against the rocks and the gravel, and unless it is able to kick the disease or some efficacious treatment is released, it will most likely die and then spread all kinds of other reproductive therons to the rest of the critters in the tank. Here we see an infected tang. You hate to see it. So, especially organisms like tangs, very susceptible to ick. So, they'll very often be the first fish in the tank to be infected. Very sad. Very sad. Oh, and the puffer. Oh, goodness. And you can see this frosting all around the fish, all across the fins. It's just absolutely. And, oh, it's, oh, God, you just the worst thing for a service technician to see. So how do we prevent ick from getting into our aquariums in the first place? Above all is proper quarantining procedure. Don't take fish, obviously, that are infected with ick right at the store or even in the same system or tank as fish that are infected. Rely on quality reef stores such as OSA that have knowledgeable staff that are actively looking out for infected individuals from the shipment, moving them into quarantine before they're entering our system. And once they're in our system, fish, especially ones that are susceptible to ick, are moved into fish only tanks where those tanks and systems are dosed with zero point 0.5 ppm copper so that we can have a prophylactic suppressive dose of treatment killing all of the ick before it can be there. So it's very important that you take from such systems where proper quarantining procedures have been taken with knowledgeable staff that know what they're looking for, and then look for a little date. We have a date on each one of our individuals in our marine fish department, so we can tell how long they've been in that system, and therefore how long they've been exposed to copper and what the risk is for being able to transmit ick. And once you're past the 30-day mark, you're really looking good. That's a fish that will very likely not be able to spread an efficacious dose of the infection to any of your tanks. So it's really just really good to if you have to take fish from a system that has reefs, take it from a system where there hasn't been a lot of new fish introduced in a while. There's a long history of non-infection. Something that's absolutely paramount, especially with new tanks, include a UV sterilizer too. Is continuously burning through and killing the therons. The infective stage will prevent even a new infection from being able to take hold. Remember, it takes a few fish to get infected and then to die and then complete the life cycle of the parasite to spread it to the rest of the tank. So if you really keep a UV sterilizer burning through those therons, it can really help suppress that first initial pilgrimage of bad critters coming through. Maximize nutrition. There's a lot of studies coming out. The more fish have good nutrition, the more good fats, the more fish meal, krill meal, spirulina, astaxanthin, all these good things, carotenoids, good fats, trace minerals. The more of a diverse and substantial diet, the higher quality feeds that you give your reef, and the more diversity of feeds that you give your reef, the more equipment they have for having natural immunity to ick. It's really when fish get stressed, when they're outside of their temperature range, when they have malnutrition, when they're getting bullied, when there's some sort of imbalance, be it chemical or behavioral, that fish become susceptible to ick. And once they become susceptible to ick, they will manifest the disease, stress other fish out, and continue the process. However, because ick is such an issue, especially for farm raised saltwater fish across the world, there are a couple commercial probiotics and potentially vaccines that different countries are working on. So potentially in the future, if you have really, really expensive individuals, you can potentially vaccinate them against saltwater ick, cryptocaryon irritans. Though this research is still in its infancy, and we wouldn't see this in the marine industry for many, 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 many years to come. But remember, in general, if it looks sketchy, don't bring it into your reef. Don't bring random alien eggs into your reef. Further levels to prevent saltwater ick from entering your aquarium depends on the type of marine aquarium you're operating. If it's a fish only aquarium, there's a lot more options that you have as far as being able to have certainty that ick won't enter. You can minimize having, as little sand as possible. That way, when you do your gravel siphoning, you can actually recruit a good amount of those tomons, those storage cysts. You can suck up actually as many of them as you can actually. Get a bunch of them out physically with the water change, then B, kick them up so that they can be zapped by your UV sterilizer. And then if you're only operating with fish only systems, you can boost your copper levels up because you won't be killing your invertebrates or your corals to levels of 0.3 to zero point 0.5 ppm. And at 0.5 ppm, you most certainly will be able to knock out most known strains of cryptocaryon irritants for being able to set up shop. So fish only aquariums have a lot more options, albeit It's really in the mixed reefs, the aquariums that have invertebrates, that have corals, that ick is the most prevalent issue because that's where it pops up, and that's where you simply can't dump a bunch of copper in there because you'll devastate the whole system. So there have been a series of new thoughts on how to really suppress ick levels. One is having the largest community of micrograzers that you can, things that eat things at the very small level that might just be sucking up therons and even eating tomants themselves. So things that are filter feeding therons, the free swimming ciliates in the water column, could be like SPS corals, sibellid worms, tridactylid clams, scallops, all kinds of things that could just be filtering out and reducing that initial parasite load. And then in the sediment, you get Macerius snails, spaghetti worms, the dragon gobies, all kinds of filter feeding fish, sand sifting starfish, things that are micro grazing on the sediment themselves that might be eating the encysted stages. Now finding the specific micro grazers that really do target and eat ick, and how they and if they can really suppress this enough of the parasite. That's really the subject of current research. But it's a thought, and there are reefs that are more resistant to ick than others, and people think that it is because you have so much biological activity simply eating away at the infective cells. And then, of course, you can maximize the nutrition of the reef and having probiotic rich feeds. There's also research that's suggesting that having bacteria, specific bacteria in the guts of tangs, or even having certain biotoxins found in the native seaweeds that tangs are used to grazing on in the wild, that these provide some sort of natural immunostimulation, and they help fish just kick ick themselves with this natural immunity. It's kind of interesting research that isn't quite well defined yet. And then, of course, refugiums. There's some thought that ick, if you're not doing continuous water changes on your sump or your plumbing itself, if it's not biologically active, and if it doesn't have a bunch of micrograzers itself, and these can be bastions where these cysts and infective ick cells can build up. So by having as much biological activity in as many areas of the aquarium system as possible, it helps ensure that those cells have less safe havens where they're not going to be at least grazed on a little bit. So combining this with a UV sterilizer and proper quarantining procedures is potentially the best way to prevent any newly introduced ick cells from being able to establish disease inside your reef. Because once they're established inside the reef, it becomes very difficult to treat the fish without destabilizing everything that you've built. Conventional ick treatments include a wide variety of chemicals, um, many of which are known carcinogens and are better left avoided unless you're in the industrial level. So, copper among these is the most relatively safe and by far the most effective. So, I would suggest if you have to do direct chemical treatment of ick in your aquarium, I would go with copper above some of the other drugs. So Fritz Copper, say for instance, is a fantastic product for direct attack on the Cryptocaryon parasite. So by progressively increasing the concentration of your water to zero point 0.5 ppm, so zero point 0.5 milligrams per liter of copper free ions. So there's a little calculation on the back of the bottle. You will be able to directly destroy both the infective theron and and potentially some of the more maturing uh, trophons on the fish as well. The only thing that is more resistant to the copper is that storage cyst, that tomont inside the sand bed. But if you boost your water temperature up to at least 80 degrees, you'll accelerate this life cycle, and within a matter of weeks, be able to eradicate all cells of Cryptocaryon irritans with that copper concentration. Now, if you have a reef tank with corals and invertebrates who cannot directly dose copper into that system because you will destroy all those everything that you've built. So, in order to not do that, you will need to hopefully be able to identify the initial fish that are infected with the parasite and be able to trap them and put them in a stabilized quarantine tank that you can dose copper into. Now, this is often easier said than done, but it is very important to always know which fish are acting strange, be able to identify early flashing behavior, and then not being able to, always having that quarantine tank, if necessary, to be able to move fish that you suspect of not doing great in there. Because once the infection takes root inside an established reef, it can be incredibly devastating, and your options aggressively start to decrease into basically just waiting out the storm and doing everything you can to minimize stress and improve the fish's natural resistance to the disease. So things to keep in mind is that copper, even in a fish-only system, is dangerous to the Nitrosomonas and Nitrobacter bacteria, which are responsible for biofiltration. So it's very important to progressively increase the copper concentration and not to spike tanks with copper. And also species such as puffers, triggerfish, the tetradontiforms, as well as the elasmobranchs, so your sharks, rays, all these fish, because of their anatomy, specifically their livers, they can't handle copper. They don't do it very well. So you have to at least do a very minimal dose, if not avoid it altogether with some of these species. So keep that in mind. Here's some other commonly used chemical treatments for Cryptocaryon irritans in marine fish. The holy grail of the reef industry at the moment is finding a true, efficacious, reef safe, invertebrate safe ick cure. So there are many avenues that people are trying to explore with this, but as of yet, nothing has really materialized. Now, as far as reef safe chemicals, something that's been kind of explored are the idea of these alkaloids, these reef safe alkaloids derived from a lot of different algae and plant roots. So things like matrine and oxymatrine, these have been demonstrated to stop the ciliates, the therons, dead in their tracks, just to kill them. But they have been also shown to stress out certain corals, and it's very difficult to quantify, of course, their effects on algae and bacteria, which there's a numerous community which runs a reef, and it's very difficult to say, oh, this is 100% reef safe. This won't throw every or any reef off. One thing that is a little bit more dependable, albeit a little bit more Darwinistic and tragic, is acquired immunity. So the fish that survive ick after being minimalized in stress, if those can be bred selectively, so we will have in the future, as more and more marine fish are captive raised aquacultured, if there can be ick-resistant strains of fish, I would certainly pay a premium for individuals that are ick-resistant. But there's also mounting evidence that there's perhaps vaccines if fish are exposed to parts of ick, just like they can be exposed to parts of a virus. That particular fish that are very expensive can gain an immunity. So if there is a full-blown ick infestation, they're already primed and ready to go. Um, I read quite a few studies that used garlic to try and fend off ick, and none of them claim to work. So I think a lot of the holistic herb treatments aren't quite worth it. But maybe in the future we'll be able to truly develop grazer species and other macroalgae and suppression species. So bacteria that you'll be able to dose and corals that you'll be able to include, or worms or macroalgae, seaweeds, all these other things that you'll be able to include to either chemically suppress ick from being able to hatch and complete its life cycle, or that will directly eat and reduce the amount of ick cells in your tank. So this is, I think, why it's so important, why the reef community gets more involved with the scientific community, because there are some pressing problems that both can really benefit from. Thank you so much for watching, and dear God, do whatever you can to keep saltwater ick out of your reefs, because once it's in there, it is just a tragic droll of a fight up until the point where it finally calms down. So safe reefing, everyone, and Have fun.